America did not declare independence in a moment of calm. It declared it while the British were preparing to crush the rebellion. In July 1776, warships crowded the waters around New York. Soldiers were moving into position, and the men in Philadelphia were still deciding whether they were ready to break from the most powerful empire on earth. The famous document came later. First came fear. That is the part memory often softens. It can make independence feel inevitable, as if Congress simply signed off on a truth everyone already accepted. But that was not the reality inside the chamber. The rebellion existed. A united country did not, at least not yet. Some colonies wanted the break. Some feared the cost. Others were still measuring whether the war, the public mood, and the authority from home had moved far enough. Even now, the word independence can sound settled. In that room, it still sounded risky. Outside Congress, the pressure was rising faster than caution could keep up. Pamphlets like Common Sense had turned separation from Britain into a public demand. Colonial assemblies were sending new instructions. Virginia moved first and hardest, pushing its delegates toward independence. The political weather was changing. Delay was becoming dangerous. Every week of ambiguity made it easier for Britain to strike a rebellion that still had not fully named itself. Then Richard Henry Lee forced the issue. On June 7th, he introduced the resolution that these colonies were, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. That language ended the shelter of vagueness. Congress could still hesitate, but it could no longer pretend the question belonged to some safer future. The future had entered the room in the form of a vote. After that, even delay carried meaning. Even then, Congress hesitated. Delegates bought time. They delayed the vote. They appointed a committee to draft a declaration in case the break finally came. Thomas Jefferson began writing, while the decision itself was still unresolved. That detail matters. The words were being prepared before the outcome was secure. Independence was not born as a victory speech. It was written in the tense space between possibility and failure. Before it became a national text, it was contingency planning. When Congress met on July 1st, the coalition began to crack in full view. South Carolina resisted. Pennsylvania resisted. Delaware was divided. New York still lacked authority to support the move. This was not a ceremonial moment. It was a live political failure unfolding at the edge of war. If too many colonies broke away from the coalition, the rebellion would still exist. But the United Declaration the world now remembers might never happen in that form. That night was one of pressure, persuasion, and uncertainty. Delegates argued behind closed doors. Messages moved, positions shifted. Men who understood the scale of the decision also understood the scale of the danger waiting outside Philadelphia. If Congress failed to act, the rebellion would remain suspended between resistance and submission. If it acted, there would be no path back. The choice was narrowing, and time was not working in their favor. On July 2nd, the balance changed. South Carolina reversed itself. Pennsylvania's delegation shifted. Caesar Rodney rode in from Delaware and helped break the tie. The resolution passed. That was the real break. Not July 4th, July 2nd. That was the day Congress voted to separate from Britain and turn a rebellion into an explicit claim of nationhood. It should have felt triumphant. Instead, it carried the heavy feeling of a door closing behind them. After that vote, defeat would mean something far larger than a failed protest. The rebellion had crossed into open political revolution. But the vote alone was not enough. Congress had chosen independence. It still had to explain it. The war now needed a public argument, something that could justify the rupture to colonists, foreign powers, and anyone deciding whether this rebellion was only disorder or the beginning of a new kind of politics. That is where Jefferson's draft entered the center of the story, not as untouched genius, but as the starting point for a coalition under pressure. Jefferson wrote the first version, but the famous document was shaped by committee review, political editing, and congressional revision. Franklin softened language. Adams pushed arguments. Congress cut, changed, and negotiated. Line by line, the Declaration was tightened into something bolder, cleaner, and more survivable. The text that emerged was not pure inspiration preserved on paper. It was a document forced into final form by compromise, urgency, and the need to hold a fragile wartime alliance together. One of the clearest examples of that compromise was the clause they removed. Jefferson's draft had condemned the slave trade and blamed the Crown for sustaining it. Congress deleted the passage. The coalition would not hold if that fight remained inside the text. So even at the moment of announcing universal principles, the delegates were already revealing the limits of their own consensus. The Declaration was powerful. It was also compromised before it ever left the room. The argument would travel outward. The contradiction would travel with it. On July 4th, Congress adopted the final text. It was the day the words became official, but it was not the day the decision began. By then, independence had already been chosen. July 4th gave the break its language. July 2nd had given it its political reality. One date carried the vote, the other carried the argument. Then, the Declaration started to move. Printer John Dunlap worked through the night, turning a congressional decision into sheets of paper that could travel, be read aloud, be nailed up, be carried to officers, assemblies, and city crowds. That was the moment independence stopped being a closed-room vote and became a public event. Ink, paper, and speed made the decision irreversible in a new way. Once the words were loose in the world, the revolution could not retreat into silence. The Declaration had become logistics as much as philosophy. In Philadelphia, people heard the Declaration read in public. The argument was no longer trapped among delegates. It belonged to streets, squares, and listeners who would have to live with the consequences. Soon, it reached the army as well. On July 9th, Washington had the Declaration read to his troops in New York. That scene matters because it connects paper to war. The words were not floating above events. They were entering a battlefield. Men who might soon face British fire were now hearing exactly what they were being asked to fight for. That is why July 1776 should not be remembered as a simple birthday scene. It was a strategic gamble made under invasion pressure. It was a coalition holding together just long enough to make a decision that would intensify the war rather than end it. It was a public argument built under deadline and then sent into the world before anyone could know whether it would inspire allies, harden enemies, or do both at once. It was a declaration written under the shadow of consequences no one could fully measure. And yet its force was real. Congress did more than reject a king. It announced a new standard of political legitimacy, one grounded in rights and consent rather than inherited rule. That claim would travel far beyond the summer of 1776. It would be quoted, contested, expanded, and exposed. It would inspire later movements even as the country struggled to live up to it. But in the moment itself, nobody inside that chamber could experience it as neat historical destiny. They were choosing under pressure, with incomplete unity, and with British power gathering against them. So, the clearest way to understand July 1776 is not as parchment under glass. It is as a sequence of tightening choices. Pressure from pamphlets and assemblies. A resolution that forced the question. A deadlock that nearly held. A breakthrough that changed the war. A text revised into coalition language. A printed document racing into public life. Independence was not a single scene. It was a chain reaction. That is what America chose in July 1776. Not peace, not certainty, not even unity without compromise. It chose escalation. It chose to give the rebellion a name the empire could never forgive. And by doing that, it changed the war, changed the stakes, and changed the political imagination of the Atlantic world. The Declaration became famous. But first, it became irreversible. That is why the story still matters. Not because the words were elegant, but because the choice behind them was dangerous.